Superior tactics and timely decisions have won many battles even in the face of high odds. World War II is full of lessons. One particular battle demonstrated that air assets from carriers, if properly utilized, could defeat a superior surface force. Midway is a tiny place with a big history. Midway engagement between Imperial Japanese Navy and much inferior U.S. Navy is the most important engagement of the World War II in the Pacific theater. This was the war where Japan had the initiative and all the power, whereas all American moves had to be reactive to the expected Japanese plan of operations. This was the battle in which air power finally came of age. Role of air power was so predominant in this naval warfare that battle between great surface fleets was decided without naval surface forces seeing each other throughout the battle. Today we will walk through an intriguing battle that is intensely debated till date, that is the Battle of Midway. History in its simplest form is a series of causes and effects, and it is often difficult to decide at what precise point in time an historical narrative ought to start. Ever since 1937, the Japanese had been eager to join hands with Nazis. Hitler's victories of 1940 stimulated the Japanese plan. Japanese campaign against China was facing resistance as Russia, British and US continued to give them material support. On the other hand, Germany, as the victor over France and Netherlands, was to be respected for its possession. In 1940, Japan entered into a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy against allies. It also signed a 5-year non-aggression pact with Russia to protect its flanks while driving towards south. Japan, when entered into a military alliance with Germany and Italy, strained her relations with U.S. The Japanese industrial and military base depended on U.S. imports as Japan had no oil and raw material reserves. In order to capture alternate energy resources and to reduce dependence on American imports, Japanese forces advanced towards Indochina, capturing many cities. U.S. President Roosevelt issued an embargo by early 1941 on U.S. oil, rubber and scrap iron exports to Japan in retaliation. Shortly after that, British and Dutch also imposed embargoes on Japan by July 1941. Complete embargo on oil hit the Japanese forces and industry very hard, and her oil reserves started depleting very fast. To get oil, Japan had to decide one of the two options available: retreat or fight with the Americans, Britain and Dutch to capture the oil-producing areas for subsequent conquests. Japan chose the latter one as it was more honorable and profitable path. The Japanese adopted two split approaches. They camouflaged their plans by initiating diplomatic talks with Washington, and started planning for retaliatory offensive actions in case negotiations were failed. After the failure of negotiations, on the 1st of December 1941, the Emperor approved decision to go to war. Attack on Pearl Harbor followed the decision. Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed 3 American carrier, 8 battleships and 200 aircraft on ground. Events like Pearl Harbor swung the public opinion of the Western world sharply against the Japanese Empire. This prompted the United States, United Kingdom and France to provide war supplies to Republic of China. Enormous victories of Japanese Empire boosted the morale of Japanese commanders, and resultantly, their leadership decided to remain offensive. Japanese speedy blitzes thereafter continued, and within months they were in control of Philippines, Singapore, East Indies, Wake Island, New Britain, Gilbert Islands, Java, Borneo, French Indochina, Malaya and Guam. Pacific defensive perimeter envisaged in Basic War Plan had thus been established. Apart from consolidation of conquests to date, Japanese had 3 options. 1. To move southward against Australia. 2. To move westward against India and Ceylon. 3. To move eastward against Hawaii. They went for first option. However, during the execution, 2 important events turned their orientation to the third option. U.S. conducted a bombing campaign under the command of Colonel Doolittle over Tokyo on the 18th of April 1942. Japanese population doubted their own leadership. Assuming that the U.S. bombers flew from Midway for Doolittle raid, the importance of the Midway for any future advances in the Pacific as well as in the East was acknowledged. During southward move, after the successful invasion over Tulagi Islands, the Japanese fleet carriers entered into the Coral Sea with the intention of finding and destroying U.S. naval fleet. On 7 and 8 May 1942, the carrier forces from both the sides exchanged heavy airstrikes and suffered heavy losses, decided to disengage and retire from the battle area. Thus, to eliminate U.S. Pacific Fleet, Japanese Imperial Headquarters finally made a decision to attack and capture Midway. Invasion of Midway was mainly aimed at destruction of U.S. fleet and to negotiate favorable deal with U.S. Let me now orientate you about Midway Atoll, around which this famous battle revolves. Midway is a small atoll comprising two small islets, Sand Island and Eastern Island. It has an overall area of 2 square miles. During WW2, major powers of the Pacific Ocean were Japan and United States, which were located approximately 4,400 miles apart. U.S. maintained bases at Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guam and Wake. Midway were the last islands in the chain of Hawaii Islands, about 1,300 miles from Pearl Harbor and 1,700 miles from the east coast of Japan. U.S. considered it to be an unsinkable carrier. The name Midway is because of the near equal proximity from Japan and U.S. West Coast. In March 1940, U.S. declared Midway as the second most important place after Pearl Harbor. Facilities available at Midway included a harbor, battleships and submarine refueling station, and an air base with 2 runways capable of handling more than 100 aircraft. The island was also equipped with 2 radars. Americans considered these islands as unsinkable aircraft carrier used as a forward defense line, refueling, replenishing station and safeguard of U.S. and Australian SLOCs. Japanese, on other hand, weighed its importance as jump-off base to facilitate reconnaissance and control of future operations for extending defensive perimeter around Japan in Pacific. The Japanese strategy was aimed to invade Midway Islands to gain control over Pacific Ocean and to draw out the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that it could be engaged and destroyed in a decisive battle. The Midway operation had 4 central objectives. 1. To capture Midway for subsequent attack on Hawaii to establish an advance air base. 2. To interdict SLOCs between Australia and U.S. 3. To extend outer defense parameter of Japanese territory against attack on mainland of Japan. 4. Simultaneous move towards Aleutian Islands to dilute U.S. Navy. The American aim was to foil enemy's seaward aggression while remaining within the range of land-based aircraft of Midway. Its objectives were 1. To counter any Japanese move to Hawaii. 2. To strengthen Midway defenses against Japanese invasion force. 3. To position the forces around Midway before arrival of Japanese submarines. Japan was headed by Hirohito as Emperor of Japan. Gen Tojo was the War Minister and Admiral Yamamoto was Commander-in-Chief of Combined Fleet on board and Vice Admiral Nagumo was Commander Main Carrier Strike Force. USA was headed by Franklin D. Roosevelt as President of United States, Admiral Nimitz, who had 2 exceptionally skilled naval commanders, Rear Admiral R.A. Spruance as a Task Force CDR and Rear Admiral Fletcher who was Tactical CDR of aircraft carrier, Yorktown. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was a graduate of Harvard University and had served as naval attaché to United States. An undisputed genius, who had the capacity to take bold decisions. He was highly respected as national hero. Admiral Chester William Nimitz was an experienced, calm and decisive personality. Rightly chosen to rebuild U.S. fleet strength. His leadership skills were evident from successes he brought during battles of Coral Sea and Midway. He was a driving force behind air power in naval warfare. With operation planned on the 4th of June 1942, Japanese Imperial Navy embarked upon a very ambitious and complex plan architected by Admiral Yamamoto. To meet the attack deadline, all the groups were to sail between 26 and the 29th of May from different ports and harbors. As planned, the Japanese decided to expand the objectives of this campaign and include the simultaneous capture of key points in Aleutians. Therefore, the initial blow was to be staged in the northern area on the 3rd of June, by Aleutians force only. As per plan, the submarine force comprising of 16 submarines was to deploy on the 1st of June in 3 layers between Hawaii and Midway. The primary aim of this force was to detect and attack U.S. ships moving from Hawaii to Midway. Main Carrier Strike Force comprised of 03 aircraft carriers, 02 battleships, 01 cruisers, 11 destroyers and 261 aircraft. Vice Admiral Nagumo was to deploy towards west-northwest of Midway to attack and destroy the enemy air elements and other defenses. Another task force comprising of 01 light carrier, 08 aircraft, 05 battleships, 03 cruisers and 11 destroyers was following the main strike force. Admiral Yamamoto was looking after the whole operation from this group. The second carrier strike force was deployed to carry out airstrikes at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians Islands to occupy Attu, Atak and Kiska Islands. The Aleutian Group took its position south of the islands for attack on the 3rd of June. Midway Invasion Force was under the command of Vice Admiral Kondo. It was comprised of 1 light carrier with 24 aircraft on board, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers and 5,000 men in 12 transport ships. It was positioned southwest of Midway for landing on the islands on the 6th of June. The main focus of Japanese plan was to keep the assets out of the reach of American surveillance planes to achieve surprise. Admiral Yamamoto believed that even if U.S. did not fall for Aleutian maneuver, U.S. forces would not be able to reach Midway before N-Day, i.e. the 7th of June. In case they returned before N-Day, Japanese carrier force and aircraft based at Midway would attack Americans and maneuver to cut off their line of retreat. Remnants of U.S. Pacific Fleet would then be attacked by Japanese battleships closing in from northwest. Japanese plan did not cater for variations and were fixated on the plan. Pre-battle air reconnaissance was not planned and they relied on submarines, which got late. Moreover, America occupied French frigate shoals, denying refueling facilities to 4-engine H-8K, Emily, flying boats. Thus, Japan was deprived of any knowledge concerning the movements of the American carriers immediately before the battle. Crypto-analyst CDR Joseph Rochefort at Pearl Harbor had cracked Japanese code JN-25 and knew about Japanese Midway plan. This development provided Admiral Nimitz leverage over Admiral Yamamoto. By the 23rd of May, the fleet staff was able to predict the Japanese plan of attack on the Midway on the 4th of June 1942. However, at this time American fleet was significantly weak as compared to Japanese forces. Only 2 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise and Hornet, were available, whereas USS Yorktown was badly damaged during Battle of Coral Sea and required intensive repair. However, due to institutionalized damage control procedures at U.S. Navy, it was recovered in battle-worthy state within 48 hours after rigorous efforts. Based on the intelligence reports, Admiral Nimitz divided its fleet in 3 groups. The carrier strike force comprised of 03 aircraft carriers, 06 cruisers, 214 aircrafts and 13 destroyers. This group was led by Vice Admiral Spruance and dispatched to Point Luck, 325 nm northeast of Midway. The Aleutian Defense Group consisted of 02 cruisers, 04 destroyers and 6 submarines. The other 19 submarines were deployed in 3 groups at 100, 150 and 200 miles from Midway to cordon the approaches in the NW and SW sectors. Air search up to 700 miles radius was planned. The shore-based air and local defense made up 130 aircraft, 25 torpedo bombers and early warning. American forces were positioned around Midway by the 30th of May, before arrival of Japanese submarines. The comparison shows that Japanese Imperial Navy enjoyed a clear edge in all regimes while being exclusive in battleships. Japanese had an understanding that they had 3-to-1 superiority ratio in carriers and aircraft. However, this was not true. Japanese outnumbered American in almost all departments. However, parity prevailed at the rate of 1 to 1.1. The Aleutian Striking Force launched carrier aircraft attack and bombed Dutch Harbor on June 3 and 4. Avoiding attacks by American land-based planes, they landed small forces on the islands of Kiska and Attu on 6 and the 7th of June respectively. But the Americans knew what was happening. These attacks in the north proved that U.S. intelligence reports were reliable and accurate. After departure from Japan on the 27th of May, no further information reached Nagumo. He never learned about the intercepted transmission of an American submarine on the 29th of May, in the vicinity of the Japanese transport group, nor that the radio traffic from Hawaii had sharply increased, or that Operation K, a scheduled long-range air reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, had been cancelled. Yamamoto did not pass any of this vital information to Nagumo, because he had decided on a policy of strict radio silence. He assumed that Akagi had picked up the same transmissions he had been receiving on board Yamato from Tokyo, but Akagi did not. Even before the launch of his Midway strike, Nagumo was deprived of all the information he needed to assess the American carrier threat. Whereas, U.S. forces were already deployed in Pacific. On 04th June 1942, the U.S. search planes at Midway departed at 0415 for the usual search operations. After 1 hour 30 minutes, U.S. search pilot reported that many planes were heading Midway, which was later confirmed by the U.S. radar at Midway. Minutes later, another search pilot came up with the most important information, the position of 2 Japanese aircraft carriers. At 0430 hours, reaching 230 nm northwest of Midway, Japanese fleet commander sent first strike of 108 aircraft to attack on Midway Island. After 15 minutes, 7 scout aircraft were also sent to the southeastern direction to search for any possible U.S. aircraft carriers. A recce mission was also flown from cruiser Tone towards southeast. Nagumo had sent only half of his available aircraft against Midway and kept the rest on the deck, armed with torpedoes to attack the American vessels. At 0600 hours, 26 Marine fighters, 1, were scrambled from Midway to intercept the approaching 108 Japanese aircraft. Moreover, American bombers, 2, also took off from Midway to attack the Japanese carriers as reported by search plane. At the same time, U.S. fighters intercepted the raid about 40 miles from Midway, but were totally outnumbered and annihilated as 17 were shot down by superior Japanese fighters, whereas Japanese lost only 6 aircraft. Japanese bombers dropped their first bomb on Midway at 0639 hours. Within the next half an hour, almost everything above ground was destroyed, with very little damage to the runways. At 0700 hours, first attack on Midway was complete. On recovery, the attack leader recommended another attack on Midway to Admiral Nagumo. Nagumo did not know the position of U.S. carriers. Therefore, at 0715 hours he issued the fateful order to re-equip the aircraft with bombs in place of torpedoes for second strike on Midway. 13 minutes later, Japanese search plane reported American ships 200 miles to the northeast of Midway, but with no mention of a carrier. At 0745 hours, Nagumo halted the weapons change on remaining aircraft and waited for further report. Meanwhile, 16 bombers that took off from Midway had reached the Japanese carriers. They were also dealt severely by Japanese fighters. Only 8 out of 16 bombers returned to Midway. Amidst all this, the recovery of strike aircraft coming from Midway had started. In terrible indecision, the Japanese commander waited for the news from search plane, and at last at 0820, Japanese search pilot confirmed sighting of a U.S. aircraft carrier. Nagumo withdrew to the north to continue recovery and to reorganize his forces. With 2 critical tasks in hand, seizing the island and attacking the American fleet, Nagumo hesitated when he should have acted. On the other side, U.S. Carrier Strike Force commander had only one task, to destroy the Japanese carriers. He launched an air attack comprising 142 aircraft from all 3 carriers at 0705, mixing low-level torpedo bombers with high-level dive bombers and escorted by fighters. But the squadrons became separated. At 0930, first wave of 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from U.S. carrier Hornet attacked the Japanese carrier. This attack was quickly followed by a second wave of 14 Devastator torpedo bombers from Enterprise. At 10:15, the third wave of 12 Devastators from Yorktown attacked. All these unescorted torpedo bombers scored no hits and were quickly overwhelmed by the Zeros. In all, only 6 of 41 planes returned after these attacks. The fourth group, comprising of Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, which could not locate Japanese carriers, previously arrived at 1022 hours at 14,000 feet. They spotted the Japanese carrier force. The 4 carriers were in a diamond formation. The American pilots decided to go for 2 southern carriers. The decks of the carriers were covered with planes, which by then were ready to launch, full of fuel and ammunition. The violent evasive maneuvers had prevented the Japanese carriers from launching more Cap-A-C, while those already airborne were at a low altitude engaging the torpedo bombers of third wave and could not climb in time to meet the new threat. They dived and dropped their bombs on Kaga, hitting her with 4 bombs, which was immediately engulfed with flames and explosions. Meanwhile, 03 planes attacked flagship Akagi, which was also hit successfully. 19. Meanwhile, the fifth group of dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown approached on the eastern carrier Soryu. The Japanese fighters intercepted them, but 13 aircraft survived. The carrier took all evasive actions, but the bombers managed to score 3 hits. The third carrier was also fatally damaged. Within 5 minutes, the Americans destroyed 3 mighty Japanese aircraft carriers. However, the fourth Japanese carrier Hiryu drifted towards northwest and escaped the assault. It was from this carrier that the Japanese launched 2 strikes at 10:30 and 1130 hours respectively to destroy American carriers. First strike sighted U.S. carrier Yorktown at 1230 hours, which was engaged in refueling U.S. bombers after the attack. The fighters intercepted the Japanese bombers, but 6 bombers succeeded in reaching the Yorktown. These aircraft scored 3 hits. An hour later, second strike mistakenly attacked the same damaged carrier and inflicted further damage. Although the damage control parties managed to keep the ship afloat, however, she was again hit by 2 torpedoes fired from a Japanese submarine. The ship was eventually abandoned at 1500 hours. At 1600 hours, 24 dive bombers were launched from carrier Enterprise to search for Japanese fourth carrier Hiryu. At 1715 hours, they sighted the carrier and positioned for attack. They encountered no fighter resistance. This attack also resulted in a success, and the U.S. bombers destroyed the fourth Japanese carrier till 1730 hours. The action of the 4th of June had decided the Battle of Midway. By midnight, the Japanese commander Yamamoto had to face the facts. There were 2 American carriers still operational, and Japanese surface vessels would almost certainly be caught by airstrikes at dawn. Therefore, he reluctantly cancelled the Midway operation at 0255 hours on the 5th of June 1942 and ordered a general withdrawal to the west. All 4 Japanese carriers sank by next morning. On the 6th of June, Enterprise and Hornet attacked retreating cruisers. During this attack, both cruisers MOGANI and MIKUMA were hit. MOGANI escaped and MIKUMA sunk. Carrier Yorktown and destroyer Hammond were torpedoed by Japanese submarine, both later sank and ended the Battle of Midway. In the Battle of Midway, Americans lost around 300 men, 1 carrier Yorktown, 147 aircraft and only 1 destroyer, while Japanese losses were far more severe. 332 planes were destroyed, 4 carriers were sunk along with 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers, and more than 3,000 men were killed. Japanese still had assets, but had lost the very men needed to launch such an offensive. Analysis of Battle of Midway reveals that Midway Island had a strategic importance in the Pacific Ocean during WW II. Americans used it as an unsinkable carrier. Japan made a correct but hasty decision of Midway conquest. Japanese invasion plan was complex and based on assumptions. There was no alternate plan to cater for contingency. Moreover, surveillance and reconnaissance missions were not given due importance. Based on correct and timely intelligence information, U.S. Navy made a simple, logical and executable plan with special emphasis on early detection and reconnaissance. Japanese were denied to employ their immense superiority in surface ships. U.S. Navy had channelized communication among all tiers, whereas Japan Navy had gaps in communication. U.S. Navy had better damage control on carriers than Japanese. Both America and Japan used their latest technology. Japan was having edge in torpedo technology, and Zero fighter plane were superior to U.S. aircraft. Moreover, Japanese combatants were highly experienced in comparison to U.S. combatants. U.S. commander displayed timely decision-making. Whereas, due to Japanese commander's indecisiveness, precious time was lost at the critical juncture. U.S. staggered and multi-layered attack saturated Japanese defense and proved to be a decisive punch against Japanese might. Loss of trained personnel was the biggest loss of Japanese Navy in Battle of Midway. Midway was no doubt one of those rare battles in which a numerically inferior force snatched victory from a superior force and thereby changed the course of war. The Battle of Midway was the first naval encounter in which the combat ships never came close to each other. It marked the emergence of the aircraft carriers as a necessary punch in naval warfare. As Captain Edwin T. Layton said, at Midway the Japanese lost or left behind a naval air force that had been the terror of the Pacific, an elite force, an overwhelming force that would never again come back and spread destruction and fear as it had over the first 6 months of the war. Thanks for watching the video.